The year is 1871, and if you were standing on the coast of Costa Rica, you'd be looking at a wall of green so thick it felt like the world ended at the shoreline. For most of human history, the banana was a ghost. In the United States, it was so rare that people at the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition paid a dime, the price of a full meal, just to get a single, foil-wrapped slice of this exotic fruit from the tropics. It was a luxury for the elite, a strange, curved curiosity that felt like it belonged on another planet. Nobody could have predicted that this fruit would soon trigger wars, topple governments, and create one of the most powerful corporate machines the world has ever seen. The story of the United Fruit Company doesn't actually start with a banana. It starts with a railroad, specifically a railroad to nowhere. Miner Keith was a 20-something American with more ambition than sense. His uncle had secured a contract with the Costa Rican government to build a railroad connecting the capital, San Jose, to the Caribbean port of Limon. It sounds like a straightforward engineering project until you realize they were trying to cut through hundreds of miles of impenetrable, swampy, mosquito-infested jungle. It was a slaughterhouse. For every mile of track laid, it's estimated that hundreds of workers died. Yellow fever, malaria, and snake bites were the silent supervisors of the project. Keith himself lost 3 brothers to the jungle. By the time the project ran out of money, which it did repeatedly, Keith was desperate. The Costa Rican government was broke and couldn't pay him. To keep his workers fed and to keep some semblance of cash flow, Keith started planting bananas along the sides of his unfinished railroad tracks. They grew like weeds in the tropical heat. He realized that while the railroad was a financial sinkhole, the fruit was a gold mine. He began shipping them back to New Orleans and New York, and the American public went feral for them. Keith wasn't a farmer, he was a tycoon in the making. In 1899, he merged his tropical holdings with Andrew Preston's Boston Fruit Company. Together, they formed the United Fruit Company, UFC. This wasn't just a business merger. It was the birth of a private empire. The UFC realized early on that to make the banana cheap and ubiquitous, they needed to control every single link in the chain. They didn't just want the fruit. They wanted the land, the ships, the railroads, and the people. They began a process of land grabbing that was breathtaking in its scale. They would go to the governments of Guatemala, Honduras, and Costa Rica and offer to build infrastructure, railroads, telegraph lines, ports, in exchange for massive grants of unused land. But there was a catch. The land wasn't unused. It was often the ancestral home of indigenous people or local farmers who had no official deeds that the UFC recognized. The company would secure 99-year leases with 0 taxes, often owning better than 50% of the arable land in an entire country. They became the octopus, with tentacles reaching into every cabinet meeting and every local police station. The UFC created what we now call company towns. If you worked for the Green Pope, as the company's head was known, you lived in a UFC house. You shopped at a UFC store using UFC scrip, private currency, and you were treated at a UFC hospital. On the surface, it looked like modernization. In reality, it was a closed-loop system of total dependency. The company owned the tracks your food moved on, the ships it sailed on, the famous Great White Fleet, and the politicians who signed the laws. In these early years, the banana became a symbol of American expansionism. It was the forbidden fruit because it was grown in a world most Americans would never see, a world of sweat, fever, and corporate dominance. The UFC marketed the banana as nature's germ-proof package, a clean, healthy snack for the modern American family. But back in the banana republics, a term coined by O. Henry to describe these corporate-run nations, the reality was far from clean. It was the start of a century-long shadow play where the price of a cheap breakfast in Boston was paid for with the sovereignty of Central America. The railroads were finally finished, but they didn't serve the people of Costa Rica or Guatemala. They served the octopus. Every track led to a port, and every port led to the United States. The stage was set. The UFC had the land, the logistics, and the power. Now, they just had to make sure no one, neither the workers nor the local governments, ever stood in their way. And as the 1920s approached, the tension in the jungle was beginning to boil. The workers were starting to realize that while they were building an empire, They were the ones being buried under the tracks. By the late 1920s, the United Fruit Company, UFC, wasn't just a business. It was a sovereign power. In Colombia, specifically in the region of Santa Marta, the octopus had wrapped its tentacles around the very soul of the land. The banana was the lifeblood of the local economy, but for the thousands of men and women who cleared the brush, harvested the stems, and loaded the great white fleet, that lifeblood was being drained. The conditions on the plantations were, by any modern standard, a form of indentured servitude. Workers lived in squalid, mosquito-ridden camps. They were paid not in Colombian pesos, but in company scrip, tokens that could only be spent at the UFC's own commissaries, where prices were hiked and the quality of goods was often abysmal. There was no medical care despite the constant threat of tropical disease, no such thing as a weekend, and no legal protection. The UFC operated under a subcontracting system, which allowed them to claim they didn't actually employ the workers, shielding them from any legal responsibility for their welfare. In November 1928, the breaking point was reached. Over 25,000 workers laid down their machetes and walked off the plantations. They weren't asking for the world. They were asking for the basics: written contracts, an 8-hour workday, a 6-day workweek, and payment in actual money rather than plastic tokens. They wanted the right to be treated as human beings rather than mere extensions of the machinery. The UFC's response was not one of negotiation, but of pure, cold-blooded refusal. To the executives in Boston, a strike wasn't a labor dispute. It was a rebellion against the natural order. They used their immense political influence to frame the strike as something far more dangerous. This was the era of the first Red Scare, and the UFC played that card with masterly precision. They told the US State Department that the strike was a communist uprising, a Bolshevik plot to seize American assets and destabilize the hemisphere. The pressure from the US government on the Colombian administration was immense. Telegrams flew back and forth, with American officials hinting that if Colombia didn't protect American interests, the US Marine Corps might just have to do it for them. Terrified of a foreign invasion, the Colombian government dispatched the army to Ciénaga, the heart of the strike. The climax of this tension came on the night of December 6, 1928. Thousands of strikers, along with their wives and children, had gathered in the town square after Sunday, Massachusetts. They were waiting to hear from the governor, hoping for a peaceful resolution. Instead, they were met by General Cortés Vargas and his troops. The square was surrounded. Machine guns were mounted on the rooftops of the surrounding buildings, looking down on the crowd like vultures. What happened next is etched in the darkest pages of Latin American history. The general gave the crowd 5 minutes to disperse, but the square was packed, and the people had nowhere to go. When the 5 minutes were up, the order was given. The machine guns opened fire, a relentless rhythmic thud that tore through the night air. For several minutes, the square was a slaughterhouse. Men, women, and children were mowed down where they stood. In the aftermath, the cover-up began immediately. The UFC and the Colombian government worked in lockstep to erase the event. The official government report claimed that only 9 people had died, 9 agitators who had provoked the troops. But witnesses told a different story. They spoke of train cars filled with bodies, heading toward the coast to be dumped into the Caribbean Sea. They spoke of mass graves dug in the dark of night. Historians now estimate the death toll was likely in the hundreds, perhaps even over 1,000. The Banana Massacre became a ghost story. For years, the official narrative stood, and the UFC continued its operations as if nothing had happened. But the trauma lived on in the collective memory of the people. It was this event that decades later inspired the Banana Plague and the massacre scenes in Gabriel Garcia Marquez's masterpiece, 100 Years of Solitude. He famously wrote that the memory of the event was systematically forgotten, a line that perfectly captures how the UFC operated. The massacre proved one thing: the United Fruit Company was willing to kill to keep the price of a banana low. It showed that the Banana Republic wasn't just a catchy phrase for a tropical outpost. It was a description of a puppet state where corporate profits were more valuable than human lives. The blood in the square at Ciénaga had barely dried before the UFC was looking toward its next challenge: Guatemala. The company had learned that they didn't need to fear the law if they were the law. And as we move into the next chapter, we'll see how they took this lesson to its ultimate, terrifying conclusion, enlisting the help of the CIA to destroy a democracy that dared to question the power of the fruit. By the 1950s, the United Fruit Company had a problem that machine guns couldn't easily solve. In Guatemala, the people had done something the company never expected. They had elected a leader who actually cared about them. His name was Jacobo Arbenz. He wasn't a radical or a revolutionary. He was a nationalist who looked at his country and saw a feudal system owned by a foreign corporation. At the time, the UFC was the largest landowner in Guatemala, but they left nearly 85% of their land uncultivated, holding it simply to prevent competitors from using it. Arbenz passed Decree 900, a land reform act that aimed to redistribute that fallow land to nearly 500,000 landless peasants. He wasn't stealing it, he offered to pay the UFC for the land. But here's the kicker. He offered to pay them the exact value the company had listed on their tax returns. For years, the UFC had been chronically undervalued their land to avoid paying taxes to the Guatemalan government. Now, their own greed had trapped them. Arbenz was calling their bluff. The UFC didn't just want their land back, they wanted Arbenz gone. But in the mid-20th century, you couldn't just openly assassinate a democratically elected leader over fruit. You needed a narrative. To build one, the UFC turned to Edward Bernays, the man known as the father of public relations. Bernays was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, and he understood how to manipulate the human psyche better than anyone on earth. He realized that the American public didn't care about land reform in Guatemala, but they were terrified of one thing: communism. Bernays launched a massive fake news campaign before the term even existed. He flew influential American journalists to Guatemala on all-expenses-paid trips, making sure they only saw what the UFC wanted them to see. He flooded US media with stories claiming that Arbenz was a puppet of the Soviet Union and that Guatemala was becoming a beachhead for Moscow in the Americas. It was a complete fabrication, but it worked. The UFC's ties to the US government weren't just close, they were incestuous. John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State, and his brother Allen Dulles, the director of the CIA, had both been partners at Sullivan and Cromwell, the law firm that represented the United Fruit Company. To them, the interests of the banana trade and the interests of American national security were the same thing. Under the code name Operation PB Success, the CIA moved in. This wasn't a traditional invasion. It was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. The CIA set up a clandestine radio station called the Voice of Liberation, broadcasting fake reports of a massive rebel army marching on the capital. They hired American pilots to fly unmarked planes over Guatemala City, dropping small bombs and leaflets to create a sense of impending doom. The pressure broke the Guatemalan military. Fearing a full-scale US invasion that was never actually coming, the generals withdrew their support from Arbenz. On June 27, 1954, the man who tried to give land to the poor was forced to resign and flee his country in disgrace. The CIA installed a military dictator, Castillo Armas, whose first acts were to return the land to the UFC and strip the majority of Guatemalans of their right to vote. The coup didn't just save the UFC's bottom line, it destroyed Guatemala. It sparked a 36-year civil war that claimed the lives of over 200,000 people, many of them indigenous Mayans. The octopus had won again, but the cost was a generation of blood. This was the moment the Banana Republic was cemented in history, not as a tropical getaway, but as a warning of what happens when a corporation gains the power to command the world's most powerful intelligence agency. If you could step back in time to a grocery store in 1940, you'd find a banana that looks familiar but tastes like a different world. That banana was the Gros Michel, or Big Mike. It was larger, creamier, and had a skin so thick you could toss it into a shipping crate without a second thought. It was the gold standard of the United Fruit Company's empire. But today, the Gros Michel is a ghost, and its disappearance is the final, ironic twist in the bloody history of the banana. A story of how corporate greed eventually collided with the laws of nature. The UFC's entire business model was built on monocropping. To maximize efficiency and profit, they didn't grow a variety of bananas. They grew one single type, Millions upon millions of genetically identical trees stretched across Central America. From a business perspective, it was genius. From a biological perspective, it was a suicide pact. Because every tree was a clone, they all shared the same weaknesses. If a single disease could kill one tree, it could kill every tree on the planet. That disease arrived in the form of Fusarium oxysporum, better known as Panama disease. It was a soil-borne fungus that didn't just kill the fruit. It rotted the tree from the inside out, turning the roots into a black, foul-smelling mush. Once the fungus was in the soil, it stayed there for decades. The UFC's response wasn't to find a cure or diversify their crops. Instead, they simply abandoned the infected plantations and moved into new, pristine jungles, tearing down more rainforest to stay one step ahead of the rot. By the 1960s, the Big Mike was functionally extinct in the commercial market. The empire was collapsing because the very product they had spent billions to protect was dying. In a desperate move, the industry switched to the Cavendish, the banana we see on every shelf today. The Cavendish was considered inferior. It was smaller, more fragile, and lacked the rich flavor of its predecessor. But it had one saving grace. It was immune to the specific strain of Panama disease that had killed the Gros Michel. However, the UFC, now rebranding itself as Chiquita to escape its blood-soaked reputation, didn't learn its lesson. They applied the exact same monocropping strategy to the Cavendish. Today, history is repeating itself. A new strain, Tropical Race 4, is currently sweeping through plantations across the globe, and the Cavendish has no defense against it. We are living in the final days of the Second Banana Empire, and there is no Plan C waiting in the wings. The legacy of the United Fruit Company isn't just found in the grocery aisle. It's found in the scars left on the map of the world. The term Banana Republic has become a casual insult, but for the people of Guatemala, Honduras, and Colombia, it is a lived reality of fragile economies and fractured democracies. The cheap, 19-cent banana is a miracle of logistics, but it is also a reminder of a century where a fruit company's stock price was deemed more important than the lives of thousands of workers or the sovereignty of entire nations. As we look at the modern banana, wrapped in its yellow, germ-proof peel, we are looking at a biological ticking time bomb and a historical artifact. The United Fruit Company may have changed its name, but the system it built remains. Every time we peel a banana, we are participating in the final act of a story that began with a railroad in the jungle and ended with a global monopoly. The forbidden fruit wasn't just a snack. It was the catalyst for a century of corporate colonialism that proved that even the sweetest fruit can grow from the bloodiest soil. When the Cavendish eventually follows the Gros Michel into the history books, we will be forced to ask ourselves, was the convenience of a cheap fruit ever worth the cost of the world we broke to get it? For Brew Lore ***, this is the ultimate lesson, that the things we consume every day often carry a history far more bitter than we could ever imagine. Subscribe now so you don't miss out on any update we drop.